Good afternoon, everybody. Today we're going to do our third lesson in ecology. We're going to look at food chains and food webs and talk about the passing of materials, the passing of energy between animals, and how the different roles in the ecosystem all interact. We're going to start by looking at a food chain, which, pretty straightforward, follows the path of the energy along from animal to animal. It shows who eats what. Now, if we look at the food chain here, we have the sun starting off the food chain, giving energy to the grass. The grass is a producer, making its own energy. It is an autotroph. The grasshopper then eats the grass, taking some of the energy from the grass and using it for itself. Let me just autotroph producer. Here we have the grasshopper. The grasshopper is the thing that eats the plants, so we're going to call it an herbivore. We're also going to call it a primary consumer. And a primary consumer, what that means is that it's the first thing to interact with the food chain, right? It's the first thing to start actually eating the grass. Then the frog eats the grasshopper, snake eats the frog, a hawk eats the snake. All of these things are then secondary, tertiary, quaternary consumers, right? It just goes down the line. But these are all also carnivores. Carnivore. At the very end of the food chain, we have the fungus, we have the decomposers, the things that are going to eat the hawk when the hawk eventually dies. It's also going to eat the dead snakes and the dead frogs and the dead grasshoppers and the dead grass. Right, the decomposer, even though we put it at the end of the food chain, it is implied, it is understood that as a decomposer, the role of this fungus is to take care of all of the dead animals, right? To eat all of the dead animals and to break them down, putting their nutrients back into the environment so that new grass can grow. It's not bad for an ecosystem to preserve dead organisms. Sometimes that just happens, right? There's not, like, fungus isn't going to run up to a dead snake and be like, ooh, yum, 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 dead snake, let me get that. It's totally possible that, a carcass or a skeleton survives for a long time, right? That's how we have dinosaurs. That's how in desert environments you see lots more bones than there are otherwise, because there's different styles of decomposers and different things that are recycling those nutrients around. So it's not necessarily bad if the decomposer doesn't get to, a frog carcass or a snake carcass. It's totally fine for that to happen. As we look at the food chain and we look at how food energy gets passed along in this cycle, it's important to know that the energy gets less and less, which is something we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth in a second. The grasshopper gets energy from the grass. Then the grasshopper uses some of that energy to hop around and be a grasshopper. When the frog eats the grasshopper, it only gets what the grasshopper hasn't used yet. So some energy is lost energy, because the grasshopper uses that energy to live and survive. The same is true of the frog, right? The frog eats the grasshopper, it gets some energy, but then the frog hops around because it's a frog, using some of the energy to stay alive, so that's lost energy. When the snake eats the frog, there's, again, not as much energy as the frog had total, because some of it was lost. So the snake, when it eats the frog, uses some of his energy to hop around. No, can't hop around because it's a snake. Uses some of that energy to slither around and move and exist. So it loses some energy. And then when we get up to the hawk, right, we've had energy that was transformed and then energy lost along the way. That is why bigger organisms need to eat more. Right, because they're not getting 100% of the energy that was passed along here. Each one of the things that came before it used up a chunk of that energy in order to survive and keep doing the things that these animals do. So there's lost energy along the line constantly, because every time you raise your arm to scratch your nose, every time you stand up to move, you're using energy. And so you are constantly losing energy as you do more and more and more things. So the grasshopper lost energy from moving around, hopping around. The frog loses energy from moving around, hopping around. The snake loses energy from slithering around and anything else that a snake does. The hawk loses energy from flying around. There is a constant loss of energy in every food chain. Right? And that's why over here, right, predators usually need to eat multiple organisms to survive because, again, some of this energy is lost from the living processes, right? From the frog being alive, from the grasshopper being alive. I don't necessarily think that's why they say vegetables are better. Because you can get I don't quite know how to answer that. If the frog never moved, would it benefit the snake? Yes, it would lose less energy. Right? So the fact that, like, if this frog was perfectly still, it would have less energy lost, and so the snake would get a little bit more. Back to the vegetables, I don't know if I would go so far as to agree with that statement that vegetables are better because less energy is lost. I think that vegetables are better because they have a wider range of nutrients in them. Right, like if you were a vegetarian who ate only eggplant, you would that wouldn't be good, right? That goes more back to like our talk of balanced diets, way back in digestion. Vegetables are generally said to be better for us because there's a wider range of vitamins and minerals and nutrients than there are in just meat. If we look now, the way we talk about this loss of energy, right? The grasshopper uses up some of the energy. The frog uses some energy. The snake uses some energy. I should have kept this consistent. I don't know why I changed my analogy halfway through the slide. Right, so if we're thinking back to that same food chain, that energy that gets lost is because the smaller animals are using the energy to survive. So if we just want to quantify this as just energy with quotes around it, right? If the frog has 30 energy, the snake only gets about 20. Right? Because the frog is using up about 10 energy just to survive, to be alive. Right? Energy used to breathe in and out, energy used to move its legs and hop around. And because it's a bigger animal, right, the snake needs more energy to survive than the frog does. So the snake needs to eat multiple frogs, right? If the snake needs 60 energy to survive, it's going to need 3 frogs to eat because the frogs are all using up some of their energy. And we see that in a pyramid of energy, which I'm going to go to in a second, but in the pyramid of energy, which is a pretty common diagram for us to see, we have things like this, where our base is our herbivore, or no, sorry, our base is our producer, and then we have our herbivore, or our primary consumer. Why won't it let me finish writing? Shoot, it won't let me finish writing. There we go. Our primary consumer, and then we have our carnivore, who is our secondary consumer. Alright, so it's a pyramid shape because this is all of the energy that the grass has gotten from the sun. The rabbit gets less energy because it has to spend some of its energy digesting the grass, right? So even if it eats some, it doesn't gain 100% of that because it's being used up as it eats. Same thing goes for the snake, who gets even less because they get from the rabbit what's left over after the rabbit has used its energy to survive. When we talk about how this also connects back to carrying capacity, right? There's a lot of carrying capacity for grass because grass has to hold up the entire. Hawks need to eat multiple snakes to survive, right? If this keeps going and going and going and going, pyramid. Right? Rabbits need to eat a bunch of grass to survive. Snakes need to eat multiple rabbits to survive. We need multiple of the thing below to feed the thing above. Right? We need multiple grass to feed the rabbit, multiple rabbit to feed the snakes, multiple snakes to feed the hawks. And again, this is because of that loss of energy that we have from animals just surviving. So this slide introduces the word biomass. Right, producers have the most biomass, herbivores have less, carnivores have the least. The idea of biomass is a count and mass of all of the organisms. So if you weighed all of the grass, it would weigh more than all of the rabbits, which would weigh more than all of the snakes. Again, because if we have room for 100 grass, we only have room for about 20 rabbits, which means we only have room for about 5 snakes, right? Because we need to have multiple of the first thing eating the thing below. So if we talk about what's not sustainable, if we have 100 snakes but only 20 rabbits, there's definitely not enough food for these snakes, right? If each snake needs to eat 2 rabbits or each snake needs to eat 3 rabbits, then there's definitely not enough for these snakes to survive, so some of them are going to die out, right? Which connects back to our talk of carrying capacity the other day. It really depends on how many of the other organisms are present in our environment. Are the fungi below the grass or above? That's a great question. In a pyramid, in an energy pyramid like this, the decomposers are usually left out. We'll see them in the food webs and how they connect into the food webs, but because the fungi, the decomposer, would have connections to all 3, right? It would connect to every level of the pyramid. It usually gets left out and not shown in an energy pyramid like this. right? When we're looking at energy pyramids, it's most connected to food chains, whereas decomposers are often used more in food webs, which we'll see in a second. Right? So if we look at a food web, right, it's all of the different food chains connected together, right? So we have a number of different paths we could follow along the way. Right? We have was that a squirrel? Groundhog? Small rodent eating the grass, and then the small rodent being eaten by this mountain lion, this coyote, this vulture. Right, we have the grasshopper eats the grass, is eaten by this little bird, is grasshopper eaten by this little coyote. There's lots of different connections that we can all follow. When we talked about the niches the other day, we talked about how if organisms all fell in the same niche, if they had the same food source, and if they had the same predators, if they had the same habitat, they would be competing with each other constantly. And you can see here that there's no overlap. There's no direct overlap. Right, so both of these, or all three of these, right, this grasshopper, this small rodent, and this deer, all eat the grass. But they're all hunted by different things. Right? The overlap is slight. It's always going to be overlapping of some circles, but it's never going to be the two circles that are perfectly overlapped. We're going to have links that connect and then links that don't. And those, if there are circles that directly connect, right? Say there's another organism that fits exactly where this grasshopper goes. Right, let's say it's a grasshopper, or for the sake of argument, we'll say a cricket is a different thing. Right, we can't have grasshoppers and crickets in this environment. They're gonna fight for dominance. We're gonna have much more of one and much less than of the other, because the grasshoppers are maybe better at escaping from these birds and these coyotes than the crickets are. So these two things are gonna focus on eating the crickets, and the grasshoppers are gonna thrive. Right? If they both survive in the same environment, if we have both grasshoppers and crickets in this food web, we're going to have a lot less grass, which is then going to affect how many deer we can feed and how many of these little prairie dogs we can feed, which if they die out is then going to affect these cougars, and right, it's all going to ripple down the line. We're going to have lots of cause and effect from having multiple things in the same niche. And so those things need to be taken care of naturally. We need to wait for one of the organisms to basically outcompete the other one and make sure that the one dies and the other survives. This food web is missing something, right, that Carter mentioned before. It's missing its decomposer. The decomposers, which we're going to put here, the decomposer is going to have a line that everything connects to, because again, the decomposer is going to be eating or breaking down all of these animal carcasses. Everything that's left behind is going to interact with this decomposer, which is a messy thing to put into a food web, right? Because now I'm drawing an extra 12, 15 arrows. But everything is going to connect back to this decomposer, who is then going to provide nutrients back into the soil for all of the plants. Right? Kind of helping recycle things back into the environment. The food web here is also missing the sun, which is going to help us, right, give energy to these plants again. and we can take any of these paths starting from the sun and follow it through up to a food chain. Right? You can always go simpler. We can always say the sun helps the grass feeds the deer feeds the cougar, the decomposer eats the cougar, the decomposer gives back to the plants, the sun and the decomposer fuel the plant, and we can kind of cycle through this over and over and over again. But when we look at a food web, we're looking at a really big picture thing, really looking at all the interactions that we can see within a given ecosystem. Right, so here I've got a little practice for us using some of the food webs and food chains that we had in our previous slides. No, I'm Mr. Mishutis, so this is not Mr. Manelli's class. You're welcome to stay, but it's not the right room. So here on this food chain, we've got some decomposers, we've got some producers, some herbivores, some carnivores. And then I have another follow-up question for you, which is which of these what arrows should we have pointing to the bacteria, right? We have the deer is fed by the grass and trees, the mouse is fed by the grass and trees, the cricket is fed by the grass and trees, so we can see the path that energy would follow. But we want to know what connects to the bacteria, and then which things are decomposers, producers, herbivores, or carnivores. And if you want to take a second and do that, I suggest you pause the playback. I'm going to give to the count of 6 or 7, and then I'm going to go through and look at some of these answers with us. Alright, so if we want to look at which of these things are producers, herbivores, carnivores, I've color-coded it here. Our carnivores are in red. Right, so snake is a carnivore, hawk is a carnivore, owl and frog, these are all carnivores. In this example, right, I know that mice also eat crickets, but in this example, we only see the connection between the grass and the trees. Right, so the mouse is an herbivore, the deer is an herbivore, the cricket is an herbivore. Everything should have an arrow pointing to the bacteria, right? So that includes the snake, that includes the mouse, that includes the cricket, the grass, the trees, the frog, the owl. Everything should be connected back to the bacteria. It makes for a really ugly web, so I don't like doing it. But the bacterias are only decomposer, and every single thing should have a line that points back to this bacteria, right? Just like we had in our other example. When we have a food web and we look at a food web like this one, we will often get asked about what happens if the population of X changes. Right? If we have a question that says, what happens if the population of frogs suddenly... Sure. What happens if coronavirus kills all of the frogs? There's no more frogs. How is that going to affect the food web as a whole? What things are going to increase? What things are going to decrease? Right? If frogs get removed from my web. Right? No more frogs. right? If a virus comes along and wipes out all of the frogs, the number of crickets are going to go up, right? Because there's nothing hunting the crickets anymore. The number of owls is going to go down because they have half the food that they used to have. The number of mice is going to go down because the owls are going to hunt more of the mice because there's no frogs, right? They don't have two sources of food, they only have one. The number of hawks is going to go down because there's less mice. Number of snakes is going to go down because there's less mice. Right, you see how it ripples through, right? With less mice, there's going to be, with more crickets and less mice, we're going to have about the same number of grass and trees, about the same number of deer. Right, taking one piece out of the food web really ripples through and then affects the whole rest of it. Right, we can talk about how if all of the mice get wiped out, then all of a sudden there is no food for snakes. So the snake, if the mice are all gone, actually, sorry, let me just reset this. If the mice are all gone is the next example. So if we have the mice wiped out, then all of a sudden there's no food for snakes. Snakes can't eat anything, so the snakes are going to die out. There's no food for hawks, so the hawks are going to die out. There's less food for owls, so owls will go down. The owls are going to hunt more frogs. The frogs are going to go down. There's less things hunting crickets, so crickets will go up. And we're going to have this repercussion through the whole food web, right? The mice is really holding up this entire section of the food web. Right? You're not always going to be asked to do the entire carry through, right? They're not going to ask, like, name the effects of every, or list every change that will happen if this thing happens. A lot of the times they'll ask about one specific piece. Right, so some examples of that are here. Right, again, if you want to try these on your own, pause the playback, pause the video, give it a couple seconds. When you get your answers, hit play, and you'll have me going through the answers. So here you see we've got 3 different questions all relating back to this food web. How would the frog population change if the crickets begin to die out? So if the crickets start to die out, the frogs lose their food, the frogs will decrease, right? Frog population will decrease. Right, because they're losing their source of food. How would the owl population change if the mouse population increased? So if there's more food for the owls, then the owls can have a bigger population, right? There's more carrying capacity for our owls. So the owl population will increase. How would the mouse population change if the cricket population decreased? If we look at this, you can have the crickets going away. It means that there's going to be less things eating the grass and trees, which would then mean that there's more grass and trees for the mice, so they could increase. You can make that case. You could also make the case that the crickets decreasing means the frogs would decrease, means the owls would focus more of their efforts on hunting on the mice, so the mice would decrease. So here you can defend either answer, and without any more information, without having more knowledge of this food web, without having like numbers, you can defend either answer. Oh, no, you can't. Never mind. I'm a liar. You can't defend either answer. If the cricket population goes down, the frog population goes down, the owls have less food, the owl population goes down, the mouse population goes up. Right? There's no way of defending either answer. There's going to be less owls because there's less food for the owls. So you can't defend either answer, no matter which way you look at it, right? If you follow it, drawing more arrows is a bad idea. If you follow it through this way, less crickets, more grass and trees, more carrying capacity for mice, less crickets, less frogs, less owls, more carrying capacity for mice. And again, this is where we are going to stop. Tomorrow we're going to look at the different materials that are recycled into the environment. Right, we talked all the way through this. We talked about how the different niches prevent right, having animals in different niches prevents them from being direct competition with each other. We talked about indirect competition. We talked about direct competition and how these things are going to affect carrying capacity and then our food webs. Right, having something that eats both mice and frogs allows them to, have less of a direct population change. If we go back to our food web here, right, the owls, if the frogs start to die off, the owls still have a source of food, whereas if the crickets start to die off, then there's nothing for the frogs to eat. Right? So it helps remain a little bit more stable. Right? And then again, we talked about indirect competition the other day when we were talking about carrying capacity and how niches could overlap. Tomorrow we're going to focus a little bit more on the decomposers and how they help put materials back into the environment. And we're going to talk about the different material cycles, so the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, in pretty broad general terms. Yeah, and that'll be that. So again, like usual, I'm going to transition this into office hours and tutoring. So if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to hang around. I'm going to get another stream up and going to answer your questions.